Sir Iain Duncan Smith, who's the former Conservative Party leader and, of course, remains a Tory MP. Good morning to you, Sir Iain.
Morning, morning.
Let me just ask you this. Now, I'm thinking it's the 18th of November. If on the 18th of November last year, 2019, the day before the general election, if you had told Tory voters that they would facing the sale of petrol and diesel cars, new cars banned in 10 years' time, and the value of the ones they already own, millions of people own, basically disappeared in terms of resale value. If you had told them that the government was going to spend tens of billions of pounds on PPE contracts, often to people who were just friends of their mates, and if you told them that they were going to possibly, but not necessarily, be allowed to spend Christmas with their family this year, do you think any Tory voter, A, would have believed you, and B, would have voted Tory?
Well, that's almost an impossible question to answer because so much has happened in the last sort of 9 or 10 months, which would never on the Richter scale of crises, that you can understand there is a certain amount of chaos going around with regards to this. But if we pick them off a couple of these issues, the first is on the green. I am a bit sceptical about the ability to be able to achieve this because, as you say, there's a significant amount of the car industry that will find that any of its production now of diesel or petrol cars in the next 9 years will slump because if you're going to make this big purchase, you're going to look ahead and say, well, hang on a second, why would I buy a car now? And so that could damage them without the warning. Second thing is I have real skepticism about electric vehicles in this regard. The trouble with battery technology is that you can't recycle batteries. There's a tiny amount that are recyclable. The rest go into landfill. So this great push for electricity means that there will be a greater level of toxic landfill as a result. The truth is the future lies in things like the hydrogen fuel cell, but the government's been very slow to get to that, as every other government has. And it happens to be that Britain is a world leader in that, whereas it's China that dominates all the battery production in the world, and so we'll be heading back to China at a rate of knots. So this announcement will really need for once, a serious amount of scrutiny. And I know it's those who are very, very passionate about the green agenda don't like too much scrutiny on this. And I think it needs scrutiny.
And we know, I mean, the UK is going to be hosting this COP26 summit. This summit next is moved down to next November in Glasgow. There's a big sort of move, this green, back in David Cameron, hug a husky sort of territory. But this is not going to appeal to your red wool voters, those Labour voters who came on board in the Midlands and the north of England, who are struggling financially. They've had their businesses shut down, income massively dropped. They're not in the sort of jobs where they can all these sort of Islington Labour people who are sitting with their laptops working from home saying how fabulous it is having their Nespresso machine at home. They're not living like that. They need their cars. They can't get the tube to work or cycle. They need their cars. They own diesel cars and petrol cars because they're cheaper and more reliable than electric vehicles. How do you think this is going to play out with those voters?
Well, I think it's a big issue, this, and I think it's going to develop over the next few years. I mean, there is a tendency for those who absolutely are rigidly stuck to the idea that everything we do is damaging the planet, do not sometimes seem to want to recognise that lives and livelihoods also matter at the same time. So nobody is arguing that we need to clean up and make sure that we preserve and sort the atmosphere and our land. That's not the issue. The issue is how we do it, at what pace, and how those who are the poorest in society don't get clobbered because that means a massive change to them. So, as I said earlier on, the truth is the future is not battery electric cars. They are deeply inflexible. Their range is still appallingly limited, and the weight of the batteries actually requires more power. And you still have to generate the power, by the way. So hydrogen, the Britain leads the world in, and it's therefore about how we process and progress that, which could bring jobs into towns and cities that were once big mainstays of the Industrial Revolution. That is a high possibility. But battery production, I'm afraid, is massively China-based. And in the short term, what you're going to see is local authorities charging to China and getting batteries from there and using them here. And that will not benefit the UK in terms of manufacturing or skills. So let's go with what we're good at and get the transition period right. That's the key thing, I would argue, with the government. And it's going to be very expensive too, by the way.
Let's talk about the very expensive lockdown we're in at the moment and when it ends. Now, 2nd of December, we're told, is the date this lockdown ends. The legislation falls. There'll have to be another vote by MPs. It does look very likely that what we're going to be returning to after the lockdown is lockdown in all but name. The whole country in something equivalent to Tier 2, which would be, of course, no mixing between household indoors and the rule of 6 outdoors, but actually large swathes of the country in Tier 3, so no travel in and out of the area, no mixing indoors or outdoors at home, rule of 6, pubs and bars may be allowed to open if they serve substantial meals, along with restaurants, maybe a curfew, who knows what. But we're told, the front of the Sun today, 5 days of Christmas, families could be allowed 5 days to enjoy get-togethers over Christmas. What dystopian future are we in a situation where the government is telling us whether we can or can't see our family on Christmas Day?
Well, I'm much like most people who will be deeply concerned that from the announcement 2 days ago, a medical professional, I think one of the advisors, said that they didn't think that the tier system works. Certainly Tier 1 doesn't work. They wanted that changed, and Tier 2, I understand. My view is return to the tiering system and get people down to the lowest levels of tiers as quickly as you possibly can. But every time we hear this, we hear only a one side of the argument, which is, we've got to be scared stiff and worry about the COVID thing. An outcome of these figures sometimes very exaggerated. On the other side, nobody in that press meeting discusses the economy, discusses livelihoods, discusses people's ability, particularly the poorest, to be able to access enough money to be able to have a reasonable life. And this is critical. And we are ignoring that. So my view is very simple. We were told we'll come out on the 2nd. We must come out on the 2nd. If the government wants to control things a bit, the tier system, but we need to be looking to push downwards as much as we push upwards in the tier system so that we can get hospitality open and make sure people can get to work. And on Christmas, the best way to do this is to not have special entities over Christmas, but actually to have got ourselves down low enough to be able to have people to be able to make their own decisions about Christmas. I'm fed up with being told by authorities what we can and can't do to a degree that we now seem to forget that actually people have the right to live their lives in the way that they think is best.
But does this fundamentally come down to people, the government not trusting us and just thinking we're all a bit stupid? Because I don't know anybody who supports the lockdown apart from like 3 people, genuinely 3 people. But I also don't know anybody who isn't being careful, who isn't, wearing the mask when they need to, and being careful in any social distancing, washing their hands. Goodness me, I've got that much sanitizer in the house, and in the office. But also being really careful. I've certainly always, I'd never sort of go close to, someone elderly in the supermarket. When we have seen family, who are older, we keep away from them, sit on the other side of the room, leave a bit of a draft so we know there's some fresh air. Everyone I know is being sensible. Is it just that there are a whole load of really, really stupid people who aren't taking any precautions? Or is it just that the government thinks we're all idiots?
No, the two things that are different from the first lockdown and now is people aren't going to stick to the rules as they did before. You can see that on the numbers of cars on the road, people on the streets. It's not like it was in the early one because people have, they've got to get out. They've got to see people. The second aspect of it is we have allowed for schools and universities to stay open. That does mean that you are likely to see, therefore, it taking longer to be able to get control of infection rates because, of course, older kids will themselves be transmitting it. But the balance is we think education should go ahead. So that balance needs to be extended to the rest of us in the sense that people are, I think, for the most part, obeying what they consider to be the base rules, which is to keep distance from people, and particularly in enclosed spaces, to make sure your hands are clean, and to make sure, where necessary, you wear a mask. Everybody does that. I've been doing it in the tube, in the trains, and sticking to it. So I think the key thing is you can't just keep on lecturing people, as some of these health advisors seem to want to do, that somehow life must continue in lockdown until we find and get and are able to use some kind of vaccine. Because that, at the end of it all, is unrealistic because jobs, businesses are going to go, and they're already going now. And that means livelihoods and lives will be trashed and wrecked. So we've got to get the balance right. And I keep saying balanced economy is as vital as health in its own way, because without the economy, depression sets in, anxiety, domestic violence increases, You have all these other problems that nobody seems to want
Well,
to
we know
factor
that
into the
long-term deaths.
calculation.
We know long-term deaths from lockdowns are higher. And even right now, we got the latest figures: 40% increase in deaths with coronavirus, not necessarily of coronavirus. The latest figures, but again, we already know that the infection rates had already flatlined. We know that France have said they're already over the peak of their second wave, and we know nowhere near the top of the first wave, nowhere near at all. We also know excess mortality. It's really, really simple. There is a tiny little bit of excess mortality over the 5-year average right now, but not unusual. Certainly no higher than it was in, say, 2018. And we didn't shut down the economy then. And that was largely due to flu and other respiratory diseases, which apparently we don't care about anymore. We only care about one, which is COVID. But also, absolutely crucially, is that, the excess mortality we are seeing right now is that people who are not dying of COVID, they're dying of other things in their own home because they've not been treated because of the COVID outbreak. I mean, we are basing an entire policy which is trashing our economy and costing more lives than it will save on a really poor reading of the data.
Yes, and the death rate per case infection has fallen quite significantly. It was at around about 3% in the first lockdown. It's down around 0.67%. So it's much lower, which means they're recovering. And that also means, by the way, the figure from the Spectator I saw the other day, Spectator magazine, showed that occupancy of ICUs is below the 5-year average.
Yes.
Now, we seem to have completely forgotten that every winter we do tend to have ICUs overused, people being moved. We've had crises like this all the time. So this is actually below where we would be at similar times at this time of year. And I just think that the problem now is everybody is desperately not wanting to be the one that says it's okay to ease off. But the government has to make a decision that we are going to ease off on the 2nd of December in a rational way. I'm happy to accept the tiered system, but I do think the tier system needs to have, its floor in it, which is 1 and 0.
Just finally, PPE, National Audit Office report, we're going to be talking about that later in this hour, into emergency PPE contracts, and £18 billion in total awarded over 6 months of the pandemic. A lot of it going to people who had connections with government figures. If you knew an MP, you said, can you help me? You got fast tracked, far more likely to get the contract. Paperwork not done, and frankly, a lot of cronyism, and some would say a complete lack of basic oversight. What do you make of all those claims?
Sorry, I lost you a bit in there, but I get the gist
the
of the question.
report, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, most of this is not about connections. Everybody was swamped. The government was in an absolute panic to get PPE. So if anybody contacted you, and this happened for me, it happened to every MP pretty much, you pass that on. That's what it is. It isn't about anybody having any connection or even having any knowledge about whether these people are good. You assume automatically that the government will do due diligence on everybody and award contracts to those that are necessary. But if you hear that somebody thinks that they can provide PPE, you pass them straight on to the government and say, here's somebody who thinks they can provide PPE. Most of that, I suspect, was to do with that. The key thing is, how did the government set up the terms of due diligence, which is, of course, the government's responsibility and officials' responsibility to make sure everything is checked properly before setting contracts.
Indeed.
It was a panic. Everybody was scrabbling all over the world. If you look at France and Italy, I mean, it was, I'm afraid, an absolute panic. So it needs to be seen in the context of that, and hope will never happen again because we'll be better prepared.
We shall see. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us.